Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about fantasy subgenres. Now of course, fantasy itself is a genre, but within fantasy there are so many different subgenres that your book might fall into, and it can be really useful to know what subgenre of fantasy you're writing in order to tap into your target audience a little more and do some more niche targeted marketing. So there are so many, and there are more than I'm going to be able to cover in this video because we would be here for a very long time. But you can always check out the blog post that I'm going to leave linked in the description, which has even more fantasy genres even than I'm going to cover here, because there really are quite a lot. But today I'm going to cover as many as I can, some of the more common ones and also some of the more interesting ones. Let's start out with historical fantasy. Historical fantasy takes place in a real historical time period, and a lot of historically accurate facts are emphasized. However, this is blended with some kind of alternate fantastical element. Now, an offshoot of that is alternate history. This is similar to historical fantasy, except instead of blending with a fantastical element, some element of history has been altered. So for example, a certain event didn't happen, a certain historical figure was never born. Something significant from the historical canon has been changed. If you love history but want to play around with some fun what ifs, this could be a great genre for you. Next up is a really cool one, Arcanepunk Fantasy. Probably the coolest name I've ever heard. This is a world where magic and science exist alongside each other, but in opposition of each other. Magic here is often difficult to control and kind of a very chaotic force. It's often a darker genre of fantasy and overlaps a lot with steampunk. One you may have seen before is Crossworlds Fantasy. This is where a character is transported from our world to a fantasy world. For example, the Chronicles of Narnia. Another really cool one is Flintlock Fantasy. Basically, this is fantasy with guns, and it often takes place in an alternate 17th or 18th century inspired kind of setting. It also often overlaps with a sort of Wild West setting. Considering that fantasy is often set in a medieval or pre-medieval or ancient time period, this can be a really fun play on the fantasy genre. If you're interested in playing around with time period, another one you might want to look at is Futuristic Fantasy, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's fantasy set in the future. It overlaps quite a lot with sci-fi, but because it's fantasy, it often incorporates magic along with advanced technology. It's kind of like a sci-fi fantasy fusion. Another interesting time period based one is Gaslamp Fantasy, which is set in an alternate Victorian era setting. For something a little more classic, you may be writing heroic fantasy, which is fantasy rooted in a hero's journey, sometimes the hero's journey. Classically, this meant more courageous heroes, but has evolved to include anti-heroes, morally gray heroes, or reluctant heroes. If you're really into folklore and myth, you could check out legend fantasy. This subgenre retells legends in a new, interesting way, with fantastical elements. So you might do a retelling of some folklore, or even of an epic Greek poem. It's a really great way to do a retelling with an interesting fantasy spin. Now for something much more on the realism side of the fantasy sphere, you might be interested in magical realism. Magical realism incorporates magical elements into reality, and the magical elements are treated and viewed as part of reality. Some magical realism books lean more to the magical, others lean more to the realism. Basically, it means that the magic is woven into the everyday and is simply viewed and accepted as part of the world, and usually the magic isn't really what the conflict is rooted in. If you love the bizarre, you might be interested in new weird fantasy. Now, this one is a bit odd and a bit hard to explain, hence the name, but basically it's weird, and it takes this name quite seriously. New Weird Fantasy aims to do something very original and unique within the fantasy genre. If you're writing New Weird, it means writing fantasy, but fantasy that does something completely unprecedented, rather than falling into the typical expected tropes of the fantasy genre. These books are usually bizarre and eccentric and maybe even a little shocking. If you like your fiction super bizarre, this could be the one for you. Paranormal fantasy is another genre typically set during the modern day or the recent past, but it incorporates paranormal creatures into this world. For example, vampires, werewolves, fairies, or any other paranormal being. This genre overlaps largely with urban fantasy, which basically just means fantasy taking place in an urban environment. If you're very interested in politics and political commentary, you might be interested in political fantasy. This is fantasy where the conflict is rooted in political intrigue, with conflicts focused on political power struggles, clashes, schisms, all that good, interesting stuff. Maybe one of the coolest subgenres of fantasy would be steampunk. Steampunk is fantasy set during the Industrial Revolution. This can often mean a really cool and interesting fusion of technology with fantastical elements. Think fantastical machinery and robots. It can be really gritty but also visually beautiful. It's kind of like part mechanical, part fantasy, but still set in a historical time frame. Maybe the best genre fusion to ever exist would be Sword and Planet, which basically means pirates in space. Need I say more? Raise your hand if you want to write this now. And next up would be Wuxia Fantasy. This genre is based on classic Chinese literature and involves a protagonist who is an expert in martial arts. It usually takes place in a fantastical alternate history version of Imperial China. Now, those genres were all defined by the content they included, but there are other genres based on tone, and these can often overlap. First up would be Allegorical Fantasy. Basically, this means that the story you're telling in a fantasy setting is a metaphor for something else, often something that we're facing in the real world right now. Next up would be comic fantasy, which is fairly self-explanatory. It's fantasy that takes on a comic tone, often by poking fun at classic fantasy tropes by using a comic spin. If you like your fiction dark and gritty, you might be interested in dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is fairly self-explanatory. It incorporates a lot of darker themes into the fantasy work to create a sense of dread, fear, or horror. It often brings in horror elements, so it's like a fusion of horror and fantasy. Similar to that is Grimdark Fantasy. Grimdark focuses on morally gray characters in kind of the dark underbelly of a fantasy world. And it often has a much more violent, bleak, or cynical take than the classic heroic fantasy story. And now to end off, two of the most common terms that you've probably heard before. First of all, epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is fantasy with a huge scale that stretches across probably multiple books, maybe multiple locations, and probably a huge cast of characters. There are often big quests involved and huge stakes for the conflict. And now similar to that is high fantasy. This is also probably a term that you've heard before. Now high fantasy is very similar to epic fantasy and they overlap quite a lot. High fantasy basically just means that the book takes place in an entirely different world from our own. So a lot of the genres that I just talked about are also high fantasy genre. However, sometimes there is a bit of a distinction made between epic fantasy and high fantasy because the terms are so similar, where epic fantasy is referring to fantasy that has a huge scale but is a bit more plot driven, and high fantasy is referring to fantasy stories that are a bit more character driven. But ultimately, these are very similar genres and very similar terms that encompass a lot of other fantasy genres. What are your favorite fantasy subgenres to read or write in? Are there any you've never written or read before but are interested in trying out now? Thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe for new writing, editing, and publishing videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.